Hi, I'm Georgia Raisman. I'm here today with Nathaniel Philbrick, Nantucket, not bred, but Nantucket author born in a way, because Nantucket gave rise to your most prominent writings. As almost all of you know, Nantucket has been the source of Nat's inspiration for early history writing, and he's gone on to write any number of, I think a dozen, award-winning books, awards of all sorts, from national to local. And I'm very happy to have you here today and to talk about all sorts of things that are Nantucket and history related, and thank you for coming.
It's great to be here.
First, I guess I wanted to know, I've learned a little bit about your background, born in Boston, brought up in Pittsburgh, and an academic father, and I guess an academic leanings from early on, but you're also an award-winning sailor. So is that what got you to Nantucket to begin with?
Actually, that contributed to, I'd like to go to Nantucket. You know, there's water everywhere, but it was actually my wife's job, Melissa. She was an attorney working in Boston. We were living outside Boston with two young kids. I was at home with the kids, and the commute was driving both of us crazy. And at one point she saw an ad for a lawyer on Nantucket. And neither one of us had spent any time on the island. Really didn't know a soul, but the concept sounded great. Melissa had grown up on the Cape, so was familiar with seaside seasonal communities. And so we arrived in September with two kids, and in 1986, and 32 years ago.
And so did you write your last sailing book when you were out here, or had you written your sailing books before you got here?
Yeah, one of them was published while we were here, but it had been written before we took the ferry ride. And you know, I was a huge fan of Moby Dick. I was an English major, and so moving to Nantucket was kind of like stepping into the early pages of Moby Dick. And so I became fascinated with the island's history. And as soon as Ethan got into first grade, which gave me till 2:30 in the afternoon, you know, unheard of amount of time, that's when I began writing what would become A Way Offshore. And so that's, you know, so I owe Nantucket a lot. It's where I learned how to write history, and you know, it's a place where all the archives, you know, whether it's the town records, the NHA, the Athenaeum, within an eighth of a mile of each other.
That's wonderful, and all those original sources.
Right, and that's you know, so where else in the world can you have that intensity and that level of archival material at your fingertips? So it was a great place to begin learning how to write history.
That was before the Inky Mirror was online. Well, I guess the Inky Mirror's records now are online. Of course, it only goes back to 1819, so it's not as early as the period you were originally writing
right.
about.
You know, and this is really before anything was. I mean, there were things online,
Right,
but you know, this was '92. So, but I wasn't. But they had recently microfilmed the papers, so that I was. Both at the Athenaeum, scrolling through, and it was, you know, and I literally read the paper straight through, into the late 1800s, and you know, so that was a huge advantage. And the NHA had also recently digitized their genealogical collection, which was also helpful.
So then you moved from Nantucket history into a broader range of American history. And I started to look at a couple of your earlier books, Mayflower originally. Mayflower, what I found fascinating about it was two things originally. First off, the Mayflower Compact. The idea that here was a group of people coming from not a theocracy, but a country where religion and government were inextricable. And they decided over here, and really the premise on which they came over here was that the civil government and the religious establishment were going to be different.
Yeah.
And to set up something like that from the very beginning, you know, practically the minute they set foot over here is really an amazing part of our background that may not be so widely known. We all know about the difference between church and state, but that it came from that very first football.
Yeah. I mean, it's a document that is very important and unique. You know, that said, however, they created a theocracy.
Sort of a theocracy of their own, of course.
I mean, they were pretty close to a cult, I
Yeah.
have to say. You know,
they
and
didn't like
it
their
was
strangers.
No, exactly. And you know, the Puritans were slightly different from the Pilgrims, but you know, basically had the same religious beliefs, and you know, they came here to do their own thing. but when the Quakers came over,
They
some of them were
threw 'em out,
hanged.
right.
Yeah, so it was it was an interesting combination of they saw it as a blank slate, a chance to do it anew, and it really created the tradition of Americans thinking of themselves as outside British control. That's why they
That's
came
true.
here.
Yeah.
And so you could argue the seeds of the revolution were planted as soon as the Pilgrims arrived on these shores.
The other thing that was curious about that too, or interesting, was that they came as an ostensibly Christian group of people, and yet promptly started waging war on the Indians. Was not without provocation. It was an interesting back and forth. But the use of force was not unknown to them.
Yeah, well, in
it was
Mayflower,
an instrument of policy.
absolutely, and from the very beginning, that was what they were. Miles Standish was kind of the soldier,
Aggressive little guy.
very so. As I talk about in Mayflower, there was a big change with the second generation when it came to the Pilgrims, and that generation had grown up assuming they were there. They didn't have that same sense of the necessary cooperation, and so they saw the land as destined to them, rather than realizing that they really needed to work with others if they were going to survive.
Right.
And so that led to King Philip's War, and which is the bloody climax of Mayflower in a way.
Well, after that early period, you are all of the books that your most recent book is the culmination of, are the books relating to the American Revolution. I skipped a couple,
Sure.
but and I was looking recently at Valiant Ambition, which, because we heard you speak last week in Sconset and were struck by the passion with which you spoke about doing the research on In the Eye of the Hurricane, In the Hurricane's Eye, which is coming out in 2 months in October, and the passion that you dealt with that topic was fascinating. And part of it, in looking at Valiant Ambition, what struck me was the fact that you made the point that the Americans didn't realize, first off, it wasn't a sure thing that the whole thing was going to come
Yeah.
off well. And for somebody as ignorant as I am about the course of the American Revolution, and I think many people are, we grow up
Oh yeah.
learning about the American Revolution as a done deal, right? I
Mhm.
mean, look at how wonderful we were. We threw off those British. We had a Tea Party, then we threw off the British, and now then we established this wonderful republic or democracy in a form of a republic, sort of. And that's all we know. And to go back and look at what you've written about, and look at what others have written about how harrowing the whole process was, and how unlikely the outcome seemed all along the way, until very far along,
Yeah.
was striking. And you said in this talk last week that at several points along the way, George Washington, and he dealt with challenges to his leadership. He dealt with almost coup attempts.
Yeah.
And at any given point, the British might have succeeded in putting this wedge in between one group and another, one geographical group and another group, and driving the whole thing
Well, the
apart.
whole tentative nature of history is something I think that you need to express, because by definition, history involves hindsight, and hindsight makes it look like it was a done deal. But when you're living, it's anything, you don't know what's happening.
Right.
And I think we do have a tendency to look back at the past and say it was all fated to happen, and it was a gentler time when people knew what they wanted to do and they fought for it, and baloney. The same sense of disorientation and confusion we experience today was what they were operating under. They didn't know where it was going.
You made that point at the very beginning of Valiant Ambition because you quoted Charles Thompson, this fellow who was very prominent in the Congress at the time, who knew everything, all the ins and outs of
Yeah.
what was happening in the Revolution, and decided to write this extensive tome about this. And as a result of that extensive tome, which described literally all these back and forth and all these almost things that didn't happen, and then watched as the mythology took over and decided, the mythology's better. Let's let the mythology rule. It's nice to think that we've got these wonderful statesmen and these people who knew what wonderful things they were establishing, and he let it go, and he
let it
destroyed
go.
his manuscript.
Oh, it's one of the frustrating, that and Martha destroying her letters to George. But yeah, no,
So
and he was kind of the prime minister of the Continental Congress. He was there from the beginning to the end.
And talk about whitewashing
Absolutely. Well, and that's the mythology of America began even before the Revolution ended. And so what I enjoy about history is the realization that what happened is so much more interesting than the myth. It makes these people real, and rather than statues that gather dust, these are people who had their own flaws, and but still had, were involved in creating a country that we are living in now, and has it can sometimes seem to lose its way, but has institutions that seem to right the leaning ship at times. But we'll see.
You commented in Sconset that one of the things that struck you as a child and got your interest in history was reading Johnny Tremain.
Yeah.
And I remember just a few years ago reading Drums Along the Mohawk, which is
Yeah.
that ancient book from early 1939, I think, which ignited my interest. My son was then in college in a school along the Mohawk River, and I realized that had we lost that part of the Revolution, the border with Canada would have been the Mohawk River.
Yeah.
And there were all these people who were farmers and supplying George Washington's army with food, fighting each other in the fields, as on a day-to-day basis. And they were going out to pick their apples and getting scalped
Yeah.
by whatever unfriendly Indian tribe was in league with the Redcoats at that point. And it was stunning to realize how the everyday part of the war was fought by people actually on what was then the front line, and what could have happened had that not worked.
Yeah, and one of the points of Valiant Ambition was that it was as much a civil war as it was a war against America against Great Britain, and it was a dirty, tawdry, awful war that created just animosities that. I've talked to the descendants of people who went the other way, loyalists that are still angry about what happened. And and once again, we think the narrative is a bunch of citizen farmers overcame the greatest military power,
all united citizen
right?
farmers, right?
And
All on the
thereby
same
threw
side.
off the shackles of British tyranny. When in reality, the revolution created a whole new tyrannical, chaotic civil war that the scars are still here. And you can see that the Civil War, fought almost 100 years later, is kind of the unfinished business of the revolution.
There were that was my surprise in learning about the American Revolution. What surprised you most when you were doing your research about the American Revolution?
Well, every one of my books involves a lot of surprises. I write these books not because I'm an expert in the field, but because I have questions, and I haven't seen a book along the lines that I would like to read on it, and so I set off to write it. And so for me, the process of research is an ongoing act of discovery and surprise. And one of the things I've now, this will be my third book about the Revolution, coming out in October, and one of the surprises in that book was the personality of George Washington, and the fact that the revolution came down to not the citizen farmers defeating the British soldiers, but a naval battle fought at the entrance of the Chesapeake between the British and the French that had no Americans involved, in which the French defeated the British, forcing the British back to New York and leaving Lord Cornwallis ready to be captured in the siege conducted by Washington and Rochambeau. And that kind of thing is always a surprise, but that Washington was the stage manager of it all. We think of him as permanently on his horse, the planter turned general, but he had a strategic sense that ventured well beyond the limits I think most of us regard him with.
So tell me some more about the siege of Yorktown and those naval battles that were happening, and how did that all come about?
Yeah, well, Washington, as soon as the French entered the revolution on our side, realized that the only way to defeat the British in a way that would win us our independence was if the French Navy was able to neutralize the British Navy, which up until then had a stranglehold on the on the eastern seaboard. And so for 3 years, he kept trying to convince the French to send up a large fleet from the Caribbean and make it happen. And he was frustrated year after year after year. And then finally, in the summer of 1781, the French came through for him.
And you said in Sconset that this happened by way of money, by way of ultimately Cuba.
I mean, there's so many ways
convoluted.
This wasn't going to happen,
Yeah.
that it's a miracle it did happen. You know, the French were running out of money. So the Spanish, who were allied to the French in Cuba, of all places, in Havana, came up with the 500,000 pesos required to fund it.
Geopolitics.
Yep, it was a world war, really, at that point. And so in a very haphazard, unlikely way, 28 ships of the line, these giant Patrick O'Brien-style vessels, sailed up from the Caribbean and arrived in the Chesapeake, where Lord Cornwallis and his army of 7,000 soldiers were encamped at Yorktown. And they immediately had him surrounded, and it all looked great. Washington and Rochambeau, with their army, were on their way south from New York, marching down towards them, when the British Navy arrived, also coming up from the Caribbean, but first went to New York to combine with some ships there. They arrived on September 5th, 1781, and fought a naval battle that some historians have called the most important naval battle in the history of the world.
Most important unknown naval battle,
right,
or little known naval
because we
battle.
Americans really don't
No.
want to know about it, because it was something that happened completely beyond our control, except for the fact that Washington had been pushing for this for so long. And so for me, In the Hurricane's Eye has been really fun. It gets me to the end of the Revolution, but it also gets back to my maritime roots. And it was been really fun to research, to go to France and dive into the French archives. And I had a translator who was very helpful in making sense of all that. And so it's a book that I'm looking forward to sharing with
I'm
readers.
looking forward to reading it. But thinking generally, thinking about history, I know it's not fashionable these days to think about the single man theory of history.
Right.
But you kind of come away with that feeling when you look at the issues of Washington and Washington against Gates and Washington against these coups, that had it not been for Washington, would we have had this success? I mean, I know it's not fashionable, and one is supposed to think about great forces of history driving events, but somehow I think that in so many cases it does come down to and hinge on the actions of one man.
I think Washington is one of those exceptions to the rule. I mean, just about everyone who was there at the time said without him, this would have all fallen apart. And I mean, it was just extraordinary. For 8 years, he hung in there without real cooperation from the government, from the people.
Often without money.
Without money.
Pay.
And he just hung in there. And yes, and there were the great forces swirling. And that's what made it so hard for him, because you cannot harness those great forces. They provide opportunities that can then are gone in a second. And he was able to seize that one opportunity that finally showed up after 8 long years and made it happen. But the great man of history is out of fashion. But I think all of us, as human beings, realize that in society and whatever, there are individuals that can make an extraordinary difference. Not that it's all about them, because that's not the case. But I think his example is one that surprised me in terms of being. I grew up in the '60s. I don't really think of people as heroes. The most overused term on the planet.
Right.
But Washington, yes, he was a slave owner. He was a land baron. But when it came to creating the Union, he was the one who more than any single person made it happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are you thinking about once you're beyond In the Hurricane's Eye? What's your next project?
My wife and I have embarked on the next project. I realized I didn't want to write about any more bloodshed for a while. And I didn't want to spend 3 years researching something before I could start writing. I wanted to get out on the road and and explore. You know, I've been writing these books now for more than 20 years, pretty much tied to my desk, and I'm getting kind of itchy. And so, and that said, I'm also just fascinated with Washington. I'm having a hard time letting him go. And as soon as the revolution was over, he was 51, he failed retirement. He just couldn't sit there and beneath his vine and fig tree and enjoy his view of the Potomac. He set out on a trip west, and the west then was Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. And he had land out there, and he also saw the Potomac as potentially the Erie Canal of his time that unite the East with the West. And so he headed out on this road trip. And then 5 years later, he was president, and he realized he was governing 13 independent countries, fractious, you know, that did not regard themselves as part of a nation. And he needed to do something to create a sense of nationhood. And so he set out on yet another road trip, 3 legs to it. He would visit every state.
I didn't know that.
Go to all the podunk towns, typically stop his coach before he went into the town, change into his general uniform, mount his white horse, and ride in.
And he's so aware of image.
Right, and he created a sense of nationhood personally. And so Melissa and I and our dog Dora are following George. It's going to be called Travels with George, in search of Washington's America. Yeah, so we leave next week. For one of the legs of that trip.
Well, I'm so glad we caught you.
Yeah, no, it's fun.
Are you going to be blogging about it?
Yes, I'm gonna. Well, I don't know if I'll be blogging. I'll be photos and things like that. But I'll leave the writing pretty much to the book.
That is so exciting. I'm looking forward to reading that. And I can't thank you enough for coming by and talking about this.
Well,
with
this
me.
has been
It's
fun.
A great pleasure. Thanks.
Hey, thank you.